In this chapter, I want to go back to the story of Nokia. In 2013, Stephen Elop announced that Nokia's cell phone business was being sold to Microsoft, and he was very upset about it, as you can see. He said, "We didn't do anything wrong, but somehow we lost." It's worth a deeper look to ask, why did Nokia lose, and did they do anything wrong or not? Nokia has a brilliant history, and actually today it's a significant success, but in a different way. The company's roots go back to 1865 when it was a pulp processor, not surprising for the forested lands of Finland. At that time, Finland was a protectorate of Russia, it wasn't even an independent country yet. Over the years, through various conglomerations, mergers, and acquisitions, Nokia became a rubber processor. They were quite famous for their rubber boots. And then in the 1930s, they also became an electronics company. In 1977, the company pivoted its corporate strategy to electronics and began to phase out its other operations, focusing exclusively on consumer electronics and telecommunications. By 1998, it was the best-selling mobile phone brand in the world. Nokia dominated the cell phone industry. Its products were the best sellers on all continents. Millions and millions of Nokia phones, flip phones, you may remember them, were sold all over the world. But in 2007, Apple introduced the iPhone, and that was the beginning of the end of Nokia's mobile phone success. By 2013, as we see in this sad photo, Nokia sold its cell phone handset business to Microsoft. Now it's still a successful company. More than 100,000 people work for Nokia, primarily providing the infrastructure for mobile telephone networks all over the world. But they're no longer in the handset business. At the peak of their success, Nokia's revenues represented 4% of the entire GDP of Finland and 70% of the value of the Helsinki Stock Exchange. Of course, those numbers are long past. In order to understand the history, let's go back to 1993. That was the year that Apple introduced its Newton pad. It was branded as a messaging pad, a communications device. It wasn't a telephone. It used a touch screen and handwriting recognition. Of course, Newton was a huge failure in the marketplace. It didn't succeed at all. In fact, the technology really never quite worked the way it was supposed to. But as we know, the vision of Newton did not die when the product died. The vision continued on, and it became, of course, in 2007, the iPhone. But what happened between 1993 and 2007? Well, one of the major trends that happened was computer technology continued to improve at a rapid pace. We know this as Moore's Law, identified by Gordon Moore in the early 1960s, when Moore recognized that computer chips were roughly doubling in capacity every 2 years, and the price was dropping at the same rate. This is the significant miniaturization of the computer. And of course, this is the trend which underlies the entire digitalization of the economy that we've seen throughout the world over the last 30 years. So let's do a little Moore's Law math here and understand what happened between 1993 and 2007 with respect to computer chips, which is, of course, the core of any cell phone device, the core of any computer as well. Well, if computer chip capacity doubles every 2 years, which it did during this phase, from 1993 to 2007 is 14 years. So that's 7 doublings, 2 to the 7th. What's that? That's 128. The computer chip of 2007 was 128 times more powerful in terms of its computing capacity than the computer chip of 1993. Well, oh my, that's a big deal, because the technology that Apple tried to introduce in 1993, well, the computer chip simply wasn't capable of doing what Apple wanted that device to do. By 2007, it was fully capable of doing that. Now let's take another example. A 1 gig flash drive in 2001 cost about $8,000. Following Moore's Law math, that gets us down to less than $1 by 2013. This is what we're talking about in terms of the price reciprocal of the power increase. So as computer chips get less and less expensive and more powerful, we find more and more things to do with them, and they become embedded everywhere. Well, so this is the driving force of accelerating change. These S-curves represent wave after wave of new technology, wave after wave that brings change not only in how we work, but in how we live, in how we think, in how we understand what our society is. The rate of change is being driven by technology, and as we see here, companies are being driven to death by this rate of innovation. Now, this is a comment that we heard in a meeting with a Silicon Valley venture capitalist. So when the iPhone did come out in 2007, what was Nokia's reaction to it? Well, here's a comment from the head of strategy of Nokia. He says the development of mobile phones will follow a similar path to that of PCs. But then he says, Apple is really a niche player. And of course, they'll be a niche player in the phone industry as well. We can't see them being a significant success. Well, he wasn't the only one who made that mistake. So the CEO of Palm, which was a direct competitor of the iPhone, said, the PC guys are just not going to figure this out. They're not just going to walk in and take our market. Microsoft CEO Steve Ballmer, he said, $500? Are you kidding me? With a plan? That's the most expensive phone in the world. And worst of all, it's not even good for email. RIM CEO Jim Basile said, it's just another entrance. And in terms of a sea change for BlackBerry, I would think that's overstating it. Well, we know what happened to RIM, to BlackBerry. It wasn't a sea change, it was a tsunami, and it sank the BlackBerry ship. Well, here's a promo photo from Nokia from 2007. This showed the full range of their cell phones. They were very proud of this, as they should have been. All of these were technologically amazing. They were hugely successful. Again, at this time, Nokia was the dominant phone maker throughout the world. They had leading market share on every continent. And what do all these phones have in common? Well, what they have in common is the one thing that the iPhone didn't have, which was a keypad. What Nokia hadn't recognized was that a touch screen could replace the keypad. Functionally, it could work. Well, why was that possible? It was possible because computer chip technology had improved so much. So Apple had been patiently developing and perfecting the technology over the 14 years since the 1993 failure of Newton. And by now, by 2007, touchscreens worked very, very well, as we know today. So what essentially is an iPhone? Well, it's a mobile Macintosh because it embodies everything that Apple had learned about user interface design. The iPhone was built on 30 years of learning about computer interface design. And this was the expertise that Nokia did not have. So we hear quotes like this all the time in the innovation field. We tried that already. No one would buy that. That's what Ballmer said. Are you kidding me? That's too expensive. That technology just won't work. And that's not what customers want. Well, these are all assumptions, which in the case of the iPhone and Nokia, the iPhone proved to be incorrect. PC guys are not going to figure this out. Well, in fact, the PC guys with their knowledge of interface design were exactly the ones who figured it out. The screen's too small? Well, maybe not. Doesn't have a keyboard? Right, it doesn't need one. Oh, and by the way, later on, we'll discover that people want to own their own music, except no, they don't. They just want to listen to it. That's what Spotify's all about. So what was going on inside Nokia during these years? Nokia suffered from serious internal rivalries within management. Former employees said that management was so swollen by success that they grew complacent. They had become arrogant. Very often, this is the downfall of a successful company. They say management rejected hundreds of innovation ideas during the 2000s. And one engineer said, well, it was kind of like a Soviet-style bureaucracy. Not a good situation. Not a good situation for a company in a very, very competitive market. So did they do anything wrong? Well, what we see from all of this is that they had a lack of understanding of the consequences of technological change. They didn't realize that this doubling of computer chip power every 2 years would make it possible to make a truly mobile computer. It wasn't just a phone, of course, it was a computing device. And this was another thing that Nokia had misunderstood. They viewed the device as a telephone. Apple said, well, yeah, it's a telephone, but it's a whole lot of other things besides because it's a fully powered computer. Well, so Nokia suffered from a bit of arrogance. They made a number of invalid strategic assumptions about the structure of the market and the evolution of the market. When the iPhone first came out, they displayed a rather shocking lack of curiosity about their new competitor. I learned from a friend who worked for Nokia at the time that there were Nokia executives who had never touched an iPhone even 6 months after its introduction. For them, it was a matter of pride. They didn't want to have anything to do with this upstart from Apple. And they made the assumption that their design would dominate the market indefinitely. Well, this notion of dominant design is one that we'll return to in a later chapter. A dominant design is the particular version of a product or a technology which dominates the marketplace at any given time. Well, the dominant design evolves because technology evolves. And Nokia had just assumed incorrectly that their design, their dominant design, would survive indefinitely, would be the market leader indefinitely. And that, of course, proved not to be the case, the downfall of which started in 2007. So, did they do anything wrong? Well, yeah, because they made a whole series of mindset errors. They weren't technological errors. The engineers had proposed lots and lots of innovations. Who knows? Maybe one of those innovations would have looked just like the iPhone. But management's mindset errors led the company into a box canyon, into a place where they couldn't get out of it. So here's a slide that I'm very fond of. You'll see it again. It says the world is shifting, shifting, and shifting. The world is shifting. And so our mindset has to shift in conjunction with that world shift. And then we need new skills. So in the strategy module, we'll look at how the world is changing and how this drives an innovation imperative for your organization. Throughout this entire course, we'll talk about mindset shift. We'll talk about how you have to change your thinking in order to be successful in this new, rapidly changing world that we're living in. And of course, the entire course is about the skills that you need to survive, the skills that you need to implement an innovation system in your organization to be successful in this world of accelerating change. Because we know that every product and every service and every business model and every company and every nation will have to shift one day. Except we also know that this slide isn't really accurate because the shifting is already happening. The rate of change is accelerating. Everything is shifting now. And if you're not in tune with the shift, if you're not up to speed, then you'll get left behind. So you have to innovate and you have to accelerate the rate at which you innovate. Again, that's what those S curves show. Change is accelerating. And what happens if you don't keep up? Well, here's an interesting comment from a CEO. He says, if we get lazy or slow, we'll get run over just like anybody else. That's Reed Hastings of Netflix, and he's exactly right, of course. So why does innovation matter? Well, it's got to be obvious now. And what does success at innovation require? It's about expertise, understanding, education, mindset. That's the real key takeaway from this chapter. It's all about mindset. It's also about processes and procedures. And as I've stated repeatedly, and as you'll hear again in other chapters, you got to have a system. If you don't have an innovation system, you're just basing it all on luck. Would you risk your company on luck? Well, of course not. So you have to implement an innovation system. And the rest of the chapters in this course are all about helping you do exactly that. So did Nokia do anything wrong? Well, the case study says, yeah, they did. They didn't understand change. They weren't thinking about it correctly. They didn't have the right mindset. Well, hopefully now you have the right mindset. You understand about accelerating change. You understand about these waves of technology that are coming, and you're ready to do something about it. You're ready to implement an innovation system or improve the one that you've already got. And of course, I think that's exactly the right thing to do. So excellent choice. So let's carry on. We got lots more to cover. After all, that's why we call it innovation mastery.